You feel it, don't you? That quiet tension sitting in your chest. Not loud enough to explain. Not painful enough to call it a problem. But strong enough that you can't ignore it anymore. It shows up in the silence, in the moments when you're alone, in the strange feeling that something in your life just doesn't fit the way it used to. And maybe you've been asking yourself, what is this? Why do I feel like this when nothing is technically wrong? But what if something is happening, just not the way you expected? Because this tension you feel, it's not random. It's awareness. It's the moment your mind starts to outgrow the version of life you've been living. And that feeling, that discomfort, that quiet inner pressure, it's what happens when you're changing, before your environment catches up. You start noticing things you didn't notice before. Conversations that once felt normal now feel shallow. Places that once felt familiar now feel heavy. Habits that once brought comfort now feel empty. And it confuses you, because nothing on the outside has drastically changed, but everything on the inside has. You're thinking deeper, questioning more, observing everything, including yourself. And that's where the tension comes from. It's the space between who you were and who you're becoming. Most people never sit in that space long enough to understand it. They distract themselves. They go back to what's familiar. They silence the feeling instead of listening to it. But you didn't. You stayed with it, uncomfortable. Even when it made you feel different. Even when you couldn't fully explain it to anyone else. And now, you're starting to understand why. Because growth doesn't feel like clarity in the beginning. It feels like confusion, like detachment, like questioning everything you once accepted without thinking. You're not losing yourself. You're seeing yourself more clearly. And sometimes, clarity feels like distance. Distance from people who no longer match your mindset. Distance from habits that don't align with who you're becoming. Distance from the noise that once distracted you from your own thoughts. It's not loneliness. It's alignment in progress. And yes, it can feel isolating at times. When you realize you can't go back to thinking the way you used to. When you notice you don't react the same way anymore. When you start choosing peace over approval. Growth over comfort. Understanding over distraction. That's when the tension peaks. Because part of you is stepping forward, while another part is still holding on to what's familiar. And that internal pull, that push and resistance, that's the transformation. Not dramatic, not loud, but real. You're becoming more aware of your patterns, more honest about your emotions, more intentional with your time, your energy, your focus. And once you see things clearly, you can't unsee them. That's why the old version of life starts to feel tight. Like you've outgrown a space that once fit you perfectly. And here's the truth most people don't talk about. Growth requires letting go of versions of yourself that once felt like home. But because they were temporary. And now, you're stepping into something deeper. Something more real. Something that doesn't rely on constant noise to feel okay. So if you've been feeling this tension lately, this quiet shift, this internal pressure you can't fully explain, it's not a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that something is changing within you. And instead of resisting it, sit with it, listen to it, learn from it. Because on the other side of this tension is a version of you that understands themselves on a level you haven't reached before. A version of you that doesn't need to pretend, doesn't need to chase validation, doesn't need to fit into spaces that no longer feel right. This is where real growth begins. Not when everything makes sense, but when you trust yourself enough to move forward, even when it doesn't. So don't rush this phase. Don't numb it. Don't run from it. Let it shape you. Let it teach you. Let it refine the way you see yourself and the world around you. Because one day you'll look back at this exact feeling and realize this was the moment everything started to change. If this message found you at the right time, take a second and reflect on what's been shifting inside you lately. Share your thoughts in the comments, not for validation, but for clarity. And if you're ready to keep growing, to keep understanding yourself on a deeper level, stay connected with this space. Subscribe to Return to Awakening. and be part of a journey that isn't about becoming someone else, but finally becoming who you truly are. And maybe if you're honest with yourself, this isn't the first time you've felt something like this, but this time feels different. Before you could distract yourself. Before you could go back to old routines and forget about it. Before the feeling would fade. But now, it stays. It lingers in your thoughts when you wake up. It follows you into conversations. It quietly reminds you, even when you try to ignore it. And that's because you've crossed a certain level of awareness. Once your mind begins to see patterns, it doesn't go back to sleep easily. You start noticing how people react instead of just what they say. You start questioning why you do certain things, not just doing them automatically. You begin to see the difference between what feels right and what you've simply gotten used to. And that realization can feel heavy, because awareness brings responsibility. Now you can't pretend you don't see it. You can't convince yourself that everything feels the same when it doesn't. And that's where the tension deepens. It's no longer just a feeling. It becomes a choice between staying the same or stepping into something unfamiliar. And let's be real, the unfamiliar is uncomfortable. It asks you to release control. It asks you to trust yourself without having all the answers. It asks you to move forward without knowing exactly how things will unfold. And your mind will resist that. It will try to pull you back into what's predictable, into what feels safe, even if it no longer feels right. That's why you might feel tired lately. Not physically, but mentally, because you're processing more than usual. You're reflecting more than usual. You're questioning things that most people never stop to question. And that takes energy. Real energy. But here's something important to understand. This phase isn't about having everything figured out. It's about becoming aware enough to ask better questions. Questions like, is this really who I want to be? Is this environment helping me grow or keeping me stuck? Am I acting out of habit or intention? And sometimes, the answers don't come immediately. Sometimes they unfold slowly, through experience, through reflection, through moments where you sit with yourself without distraction. That's where clarity is built, not in noise, but in stillness. And that might be why you've been craving more quiet lately, more space, more time to think, more distance from things that feel overwhelming or unnecessary. It's not that you're becoming distant from life, you're becoming selective with it. You're learning that not everything deserves your energy. Not every situation deserves your reaction. Not every voice deserves your attention. And that shift, that quiet shift in priorities, it changes everything. Because now, you're not just living on autopilot. You're choosing, even if those choices are small right now. Choosing to pause instead of reacting. Choosing to reflect instead of avoiding. Choosing to walk away from what doesn't align, even if it's uncomfortable. And those small choices, they start to reshape your identity, slowly, subtly, but powerfully. This is how transformation actually happens, not in one big moment, but in a series of quiet realizations that change the way you see yourself. Lean into those realizations. The more the tension begins to make sense, because it was never there to confuse you. It was there to wake you up, to show you that you've outgrown something, and it's time to move differently. Not perfectly, not all at once, but intentionally. And yes, there will be moments where you doubt yourself. Moments where you wonder if you're overthinking everything. Moments where going back feels easier than moving forward. That's part of it. Growth doesn't erase doubt. It teaches you how to move through it. So when those moments come, don't judge yourself for feeling uncertain. Just notice it, recognize it, and remind yourself, you're not the same person you used to be. And that's why things don't feel the same anymore. And as that realization settles in, you may start to feel something unexpected. A quiet sense of separation, not because you're trying to disconnect, but because you're no longer fully attached to the things that once defined you. You listen more than you speak. You observe more than you react. You feel things deeply, but you don't always express them the same way anymore. And people notice that. Some won't understand it. They might say you've changed, that you're distant, that you're not the same person you used to be. And for a moment, that might make you question yourself. But deep down, you know it's true. You have changed, not into someone unrecognizable, but into someone more aware, more grounded, more aligned with what actually matters to you. And that can create distance, because not everyone is on the same path of reflection. Not everyone is asking the same questions you're asking. Not everyone is willing to sit with discomfort to understand themselves. Some people prefer what's easy, what's familiar, what doesn't challenge them to look deeper. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it does mean your path will feel different. At times, quieter. At times, lonelier. But also, more real. Because you're no longer chasing noise to feel complete. You're starting to value truth over comfort, even when that truth is uncomfortable. And this is where your strength begins to change form. It's no longer loud. It's not about proving anything to anyone. It becomes internal. The strength to stay calm when everything around you feels chaotic. The strength to walk away from what drains you, without needing to explain yourself. The strength to sit with your own thoughts, without running from them. That's a different kind of power. One that isn't always visible, but is deeply felt. And the more you step into that, the less you need external validation. You stop looking for constant reassurance. You stop needing everyone to understand your decisions. You stop explaining your growth to people who aren't ready to hear it. Not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. Because you realize something important. Not everyone is meant to understand your transformation. Some people only knew the version of you that you've already outgrown, and trying to hold on to that version just to keep others comfortable. That's where the real tension used to come from. Now, you're releasing that. Slowly, gently, but intentionally. And in that release, you create space. Space for better habits, space for deeper thoughts, space for a more honest connection with yourself. And maybe, for the first time, you're starting to trust your own direction. Even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else. Even if it doesn't look perfect. Even if it's still unfolding. Because this journey, it was never about becoming flawed. It was about becoming aware enough to choose growth over repetition. To choose truth over illusion. To choose yourself in a way you never fully did before. And that's why this phase feels so intense. Because you're not just changing your actions, you're changing your identity. And identity shifts, they don't happen quietly inside. Your thoughts, your decisions, your relationships, your sense of purpose. Everything starts to realign. And yes, that process can feel unstable at times. Like you're standing between two versions of your life. One that's familiar, and one that's still forming. And you're right in the middle. Not fully who you used to be, but not fully who you're becoming yet. That space, that in-between space, that's where the tension lives the most. But it's also where the most growth happens. Because in that space, you're forced to rely on something deeper than comfort. You're forced to rely on awareness, on intention, on the quiet voice inside you that says, keep going, even if it's unclear. And every time you listen to that voice, even in the smallest way, you move closer to alignment. Not perfection, alignment, where your actions begin to match your understanding, where your choices begin to reflect your awareness, where your life begins to feel more like something you're creating, instead of something you're just reacting to. And the deeper you move into that alignment, the more you begin to notice something subtle, but powerful. You're no longer reacting to everything. Things that once triggered you don't hold the same weight anymore. Situations that once pulled you in emotionally now give you space to pause. And in that pause, you start to see clearly. You start to realize how much of your past reactions were automatic, how much of your behavior was shaped by patterns you never questioned, how often you were responding instead of choosing, and that awareness changes the way you move. You don't rush to speak. You don't rush to prove a point. You don't rush to fix everything around you. Instead, you observe, you understand, you choose your response with intention. And that can feel unfamiliar at first, because you're no longer operating from impulse, you're operating from clarity. And clarity requires patience. It requires you to slow down, to feel what's actually happening beneath the surface, to recognize what truly deserves your energy, and what doesn't. That's a different rhythm of life, a quieter one, but a more powerful one, because now you're not being controlled by everything around you. You're becoming aware of how you respond to it, and that's where your freedom begins. not in controlling the world, but in understanding yourself within it. And as this continues, you might start to feel a shift in what you value. Things that once felt important start to lose their urgency. Constant validation, external approval, the need to always be seen, heard, or understood. They begin to fade, not because they're bad, but because they're no longer essential to your sense of self. You're building something deeper now, a sense of internal stability, where your peace doesn't depend on everything going right, where your worth doesn't depend on other people's opinions, where your direction doesn't depend on constant reassurance. And that kind of stability, it takes time. It's built through moments like this, moments where you feel uncertain, but still choose to stay aware, moments where you feel tension, but don't run from it, moments where you don't have all the answers, but you're willing to keep asking the right questions. That's how you strengthen your connection with yourself. Not by forcing clarity, but by allowing it to develop naturally. And along the way, you may notice something else. Your tolerance for what drains you becomes lower. You can't sit in the same conversations that feel empty. You can't keep repeating habits that leave you feeling stuck. You can't ignore what your intuition is quietly pointing out anymore. It's not that you're becoming difficult. You're becoming honest. Honest about what feels right, honest about what doesn't, honest about what you need, even if it means making changes. And honesty, real honesty with yourself, it can feel uncomfortable before it feels freeing, because it asks you to acknowledge things you once avoided. It asks you to admit when something no longer aligns. It asks you to accept when you've outgrown certain spaces. It asks you to take responsibility for the direction of your life. And that responsibility, it's not always easy, but it's powerful. Because once you accept it, you stop waiting. You stop waiting for the perfect moment. You stop waiting for someone else to guide you. You stop waiting for everything to make sense before you move. You begin to trust your own awareness, step by step, choice by choice. And even when the path feels uncertain, there's a quiet confidence growing inside you, not loud, not forced, but steady. The kind of confidence that doesn't need to prove anything. It simply knows, I'm not where I used to be. Moving forward. And that's enough. That's more than enough. Because real progress isn't always visible from the outside. Sometimes it's in the way you think differently, the way you respond differently, the way you choose differently. It's in the way you no longer abandon yourself just to keep things comfortable. And that shift, that internal shift, it's everything. Even if no one else sees it yet, even if no one else understands it yet, you feel it. And that feeling, that quiet, steady awareness, it's guiding you somewhere deeper, somewhere more aligned, somewhere more real than anything you've experienced before. And as you keep moving in that direction, you begin to notice something else shifting, your relationship with time. You're no longer rushing the way you used to. You're no longer trying to force everything into place all at once. There's a growing understanding that not everything needs to happen immediately. Some things need space. Space to develop. Space to unfold. Space to become clear in their own time. And that patience, it doesn't come from giving up. It comes from trusting the process you're in, even if you can't fully define it yet. Because now you've seen what rushing leads to. You've seen what happens when decisions are made from pressure instead of clarity. And you don't want to go back to that. So you slow down, not because you're lost, but because you're becoming intentional. You're learning that moving with awareness is more powerful than moving quickly without direction. And in that slower pace, you begin to reconnect with parts of yourself you once ignored. Your thoughts become clearer. Your emotions become easier to understand. Your instincts become sharper. You start recognizing what genuinely feels right versus what just feels familiar. And that distinction, it changes everything. Because familiarity can keep you stuck, but awareness moves you forward, even if the steps are small, even if the progress isn't visible to anyone else. And during this phase, there may be moments where everything feels still, like nothing is happening, like you're in between chapters, waiting for something to shift. And that can feel frustrating, because you've already outgrown where you were, but you haven't fully stepped into what's next. That in-between feeling, it can test your patience. It can make you question if you're actually moving forward at all. But you are. just not in a way that's obvious. This is internal work, the kind that doesn't always show immediate results, but builds a foundation that everything else will stand on later. You're reorganizing your thoughts, releasing what no longer serves you, rewriting patterns that took years to form. That kind of change, it's not supposed to feel fast, it's supposed to feel real. And real change takes time. So if things feel slow right now, if it feels like you're just thinking, reflecting, observing more than acting, understand this. You're preparing for a version of yourself that moves with clarity instead of confusion, that chooses with intention instead of impulse, that stands on understanding instead of uncertainty. In preparation, it often feels like stillness from the outside, but internally, it's transformation. Layer by layer, thought by thought, choice by choice, and as those layers shift, you may also notice how your perspective on past experiences begins to change. Things you once regretted, you start to understand. Moments that once felt like setbacks, you begin to see as lessons. You're no longer looking at your past with judgment, you're looking at it with awareness, and that awareness brings something powerful. Peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because you're no longer resisting what already happened. You're learning from it, growing through it, and carrying only what helps you move forward. That's maturity, not just in your actions, but in your heart. Age, but in mindset. And the more you step into that, the less you feel the need to hold on to old narratives, old labels, old definitions of who you were, old stories that no longer match who you're becoming. You're letting them go, not forcefully, but naturally, because they no longer fit. And as you release them, you create room for something new, a new way of thinking, a new way of responding, a new way of seeing yourself. And that new perspective, it doesn't come with loud announcements. It shows up quietly, in the way you carry yourself, in the way you handle situations, in the way you choose peace, even when it's difficult. And one day, you'll notice it clearly. You'll realize that the tension you once felt has transformed, not into pressure, but into direction. A quiet, steady sense of knowing that you're no longer lost in the way you used to be, even if the full path isn't visible yet. You trust the direction you're moving in. And that trust, it changes how you experience everything. You stop fearing the unknown, you stop resisting change, you stop holding on to what no longer aligns just because it's comfortable. You begin to move with life instead of against it. And that shift, it's subtle, but it's powerful, because now you're not just reacting to where life takes you, you're actively participating in who you're becoming. And the more you participate in that process, the more you start to notice a quiet consistency forming within you. But stability. You're not as easily pulled in different directions anymore. You're not constantly second-guessing every decision. You're not losing yourself in every situation the way you once did. There's a center forming, something steady, something that stays even when everything around you feels uncertain. And that center, it comes from all the moments you chose awareness over avoidance. All the times you sat with your thoughts instead of escaping them. All the times you questioned your patterns instead of repeating them. All the times you paused, even when reacting would have been easier. Those moments built something inside you, something real. And now, you're starting to feel it. It shows up in the way you handle pressure, in the way you respond to challenges, in the way you no longer let every emotion control your actions. You still feel deeply, but you're no longer overwhelmed in the same way. Because now, you understand yourself better. You recognize your triggers, you notice your patterns, you catch yourself before falling into the same cycles. And that awareness, it gives you space to choose differently, space to grow beyond what once held you back. And this is where things begin to shift in a deeper way, because now, you're not just aware of your growth, you're actively living it. You're making decisions that align with who you're becoming, even when those decisions are difficult. You're saying no to things that once felt hard to walk away from. You're setting boundaries that once felt uncomfortable to express. You're prioritizing your peace without feeling guilty for it. And that takes courage, real courage, because it often means disappointing people. Often means choosing yourself. in situations where you used to choose comfort or approval. And at first, that can feel unfamiliar, maybe even uncomfortable. But over time, it becomes natural, because you begin to realize something important. Choosing yourself doesn't mean rejecting others. It means respecting your own direction. It means honoring what you've learned. It means protecting the growth you've worked hard to build. And that protection, it's necessary, because not everything deserves access to a version of you that you're becoming. Not every environment supports your growth. Not every dynamic aligns with your awareness. Not every connection is meant to continue the same way it once did. And recognizing that, it can be emotional, because growth isn't just about gaining clarity. It's also about accepting change, even when that change involves letting go. Letting go of expectations. Letting go of roles you once played. Letting go of parts of your life that no longer reflect who you are. And letting go, it's not always easy, even when you know it's necessary. But every time you do, you create space for something more aligned. Something that reflects your current mindset. Something that supports your direction. Something that feels right, not just familiar. And as that space opens up, you begin to feel lighter. Not because everything is perfect, but because you're no longer carrying what doesn't belong to you anymore. And that lightness, it changes how you move. You think more clearly, you act more intentionally, you feel more at peace with your decisions, even the difficult ones. You trust yourself in a way you didn't before. You trust your ability to handle uncertainty. You trust your awareness to guide you. You trust your growth, even when it's still unfolding. And that trust, it becomes your foundation, not something external, not something temporary, but something built from experience, from reflection, from all the moments you chose to face yourself honestly. And that's why this phase matters so much. Because it's not just changing your life on the surface, it's changing the way you relate to yourself at the core. And once that relationship shifts, everything else follows. Your choices, your boundaries, your direction, your sense of purpose. It all begins to align, naturally, not forced, not rushed, but real. And even if there are still moments of doubt, moments of uncertainty, moments where the tension briefly returns, it doesn't affect you the same way anymore. Because now you understand it. You don't see it as something to fear. You see it as a signal. A reminder that you're evolving. A reminder that you're moving beyond old limits. A reminder that you're stepping into something deeper, even if it's still taking shape.